We shot this really cool video last week on how essentially millionaires have been able to buy their way into space. The future of space travel. Images, and one of them was Guy Laliberté, who is a street performer. How does a street performer afford going to space? Now, Guy is of course one of the founders of the Cirque du Soleil, and for years have been fascinated by their story and their shows. I've attended many. I've spent money I didn't have to experience these incredible performances. But over the last few years, they just seem to have disappeared. So we got to researching what happened to them. And we found a story that's such a roller coaster that it's almost like a circus act in itself. So the story of Cirque du Soleil starts in Quebec, and two men with a passion. So to raise their first money, Slidebean walked 56 kilometers on stilts to convince the local government to give them funding for a show called Waiters of Bay St. Paul. Sorry if I mispronounced that. But it worked. The Quebecan government gave them a grant, and their show was this critical success. But like many critically successful things, making money was nearly impossible for them. The first decent money finally happened in '83. So the three won a grant to host a production for the anniversary of Jacques Cartier's trip to Canada. And they raised $1.6 million. And they set their mind on revolutionizing the circus. As a kid, when you go to the circus, it's this cool, incredible show. But as an adult, once you grow up, you start to see the reality behind it. You start to see the animals in chains. You start to see people depressed, making very little money and living in wagons and traveling around the world in this circus life that is probably not something very exciting for anybody. But if you've seen a Cirque du Soleil performance, you know that it's something completely different. In the 80s, it was something that nobody had seen before, and the world took notice.
Expectation becomes excitement. Fantasy becomes reality.
So their first performance was a hit. It struggled to get traction outside of Quebec, but locals loved it so much that it allowed them to convince the local government to fund them for 2 more years. For almost a decade, the company struggled and barely made ends meet. And finally, in '87, they found the recipe. Over the next few years, shows expanded across the US, with some even finding residences in Las Vegas, and then Paris and London and Tokyo. Now, I'm skipping through a lot of the hurdles here just to get to the good stuff. Because it wasn't just growth and expansion. It took them years of failure, of bad shows, of a lot of money lost to finally find the recipe to make their show successful on the other side of the world. Just crossing from Canada to the US and then to Europe was a big mess because they had to rethink their shows and rethink their marketing. It's not as easy as they thought it was going to be. But in the end, they finally made it. They reinvented the circus, and they got to afford the best of the best. They built their own costumes workshop, the first of its kind in North America. It could produce 15,000 pieces of wardrobe and thousands of specialized footwear. They had the most talented directors and artists and designers to ensure that every show was one of a kind. And on top of this big machinery, this incredibly creative and logistics operation, came a show that would completely redefine what they were doing. It was called Dralion. Dralion combined air and fire and water, and then turned them into a human form, and then added culture and magic. The first director they tried to hire quit in panic of the sheer magnitude of this production. But Dralion left audiences in awe, and it would set the stage for so many more things to come. This is a side note that's just less exciting than Dralion and what came later, but it's still important in the context of this story. Through this whole decade, Laliberté's co-founders ended up leaving the company. He bought Gaultier out, and Slidebean left to pursue his own creative ideas. And then coming into the 2000s, Laliberté owned 95% of Cirque du Soleil. He took control, and he had the liberty and the creative freedom to consolidate his vision. So Dralion landed them an Emmy. But beyond that, it gave them the recognition and the credibility to essentially partner with anyone. You had TV shows and miniseries and an IMAX film. In the 2000s, we could not get enough of Cirque du Soleil. Laliberté had plans to expand to a whole new level, literally. So in 2009, he synchronized performances across 14 cities, all connected to this act that he made from the International Space Station. It is the first performance ever in the history of mankind from space, not to mention the first Canadian space tourist. And his goal with this trip was to raise awareness on water issues and on sustainability around the planet. And I'm not sure people remember him for that, but everybody took notice. A funny story, by the way, Guy tried to pass this $35 million space ticket as a company expense. And the Canadian government did not agree, so he ended up having to pay a huge tax bill on it. But back to Earth. Their shows were getting bigger and better. O was this water-based show with an incredible team of synchronized swimmers. Varkai, inspired by the Greek myth of Icarus. Humanity was an R-rated show. Love, with music from the Beatles, which many agree is their favorite show. All these resident shows allowed him to go all out and elaborate these permanent stages that didn't have to fit on trucks or a carp and didn't have to move. And to me, the epitome of this was Ka. I went to Las Vegas when I turned 21. So trip. And I saw my favorite band back then. I visited the Grand Canyon, I jumped off a plane, but none of those things struck me the way Ka did. I'm not kidding here, I cried in awe when I was sitting on that chair. I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it. It is the most incredible, jaw-dropping performance I have ever seen. Every other show about anything that I have seen since that has been ruined. I've never seen something better than Ka. It happens on this floating plane of a stage that's controlled by this robotic arm. The stage can flip and drop or become this giant ice wall where performers take off and fly. There's a sequence with archers just throw arrows at this wall, which lays a path for the protagonist to climb up the wall. So when artists fall, they fall off the stage. It's below your sight, so you don't see where they fall, into this void. And then for a moment, you forget that you're in Vegas in this tourist trap of a city. And then you're living the dream that they have created. It was a dream. It was the dream of reinventing the circus consolidated. But then on a summer Saturday in 2013, that dream became a nightmare. Sarah Guyot-Guyard, a performer with over 20 years of experience, fell down after the wire rope from which she was suspended broke.
Fatal accident at the Cirque du Soleil. It was sort of out of a movie. She was just trying to grab for anything.
And this happened in the final sequence of the show in front of a live, sold-out audience. Those who were sitting there told how they could hear her screams under the stage and how they saw the other performers crying after they realized what had happened.
You could hear people crying. All the actors were basically looking down.
The show ended up being suspended for weeks. And outside of that theater, the rest of Cirque du Soleil was about to face their worst. By the end of the decade, Guy had reached too far and quality started to decline. Banana Spiel was this show that premiered in the Chicago theater and was just plagued with misfortunes. It was bashed by the critics. Then Criss Angel Believe was also a disaster. They called it a show with no core, where the tricks were evident even before the illusion began. I saw that show, by the way. It was a complete tourist trap. Also, I'm more of a David Blaine fan. Zed, Viva Elvis, and the Michael Jackson show all flopped. So the magic of Cirque du Soleil was fading away. In 2013, the layoffs started. 50 executives and more than 400 employees by January 2013. It turns out the company had over $1 billion in revenue in 2012, but it still lost money. The Cirque du Soleil had saturated the market with its own recipe. It was too big, and there was too much of it. La Liberté was forced to sell 90% of the company's stake to a group of investors who still believed that they could somehow save the company.
I believe today I'm making the best decision for Cirque du Soleil and its future, and the best decision for myself and my family.
And the new investors had ambitious plans, including an aggressive expansion in China, and they ended up cleaning up the house. They replaced their whole finance team, their finance director, COO, and all the vice presidents. Profit was the only way to survive. And then more flunked shows came up. You have the Soda Stereo show, the X-Land of Fantasy, it was night before Christmas. So a major redesign happened, as well as some acquisitions, including the Blue Man Group. And after a while, reviews started taking a turn again. The talks of a China expansion were fueling the rumors of an IPO. There was a positive déjà vu in the air, the old Cirque du Soleil that we all fell in love with in the 2000s. And after a challenging decade, this Cirque du Soleil seemed ready to wow us again. But the world had other plans.
The COVID-19 pandemic has reached another alarming milestone.
9/11 was nothing compared to this.
Doctors and nurses overcome by the sheer number of coronavirus patients.
Lockdowns guaranteed one thing. No one was going to go to the circus. And the impact was almost immediate. The Cirque du Soleil shut down dozens of very expensive shows around the world. So this company went from talking about this bright future to laying off 95% of their employees in a matter of months. By June 2020, the company had filed for bankruptcy protection. So the CEO, Daniel Lemaire, part of their new investor group, confessed to the press that they had zero revenue, none, and that they were in a serious financial hurdle. Everybody kind of knew that Cirque du Soleil was in debt, but nobody thought it was this bad. The company had borrowed $900 million to finance their revival in the 2000s. And then all these years of expansion had meant one thing. The Cirque du Soleil was just knee-deep in debt. So by filing for bankruptcy protection, the company depended on one or more sort of angel investors to come and save them. And several companies bid to acquire Cirque du Soleil altogether, and in the end, a group of investors led by Catalyst Capital Group ended up making the purchase. So their new bet was that as the world opened its doors once again, people were ready and longing for amazement. We needed awe, and we need awe and wonder to forget about what these past couple of years has been. So there is a very tiny bit of light at the end of the tunnel. It comes in the form of Drawn to Life. It's a collaboration with Disney that premiered a couple weeks back in the old La Nuba building, which I also attended, one of my favorite shows. I don't know if this new show will be enough to bring them back and to save them, but it is hope at the end of the tunnel. A lot of the stories that we tell in Company Forensics are just full of schadenfreude, but not with Cirque du Soleil. There are a few artistic, creative, and logistics achievements like those of this company. They brought the art of circus performances to the 21st century, and they sparked it with nothing short of magic. And it's just a damn shame that we've had to talk about them today. Their story, after all, it's just a circus balancing act. And we hope that they land this last trick.